Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Creating Community Through Art Education. Now, this is organized by Professor David LeRue, students of Art 434, Professional Practice for Art Educators. And to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from fourth space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities, projects, things in development across the university. We're also running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting. So those of you joining us on Zoom, hello, welcome in. If you have any comments or questions, just pop those into the chat, and we'll do our best to read those out during the Q&A. And those of you here in the space, similar thing. If you have a comment or question, raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone over to you so that everyone can hear. Okay, that's very much my pleasure to present Assistant Professor in Art Education, David LeRue. David, great to have you.
Great. Thank you and welcome everybody. We're at the end. Our class actually officially ends tomorrow. So this is one of the last, things we're doing as a group together. And I'd also just like to open by thanking the Fourth Space for hosting us today and the Department of Art Education, which has provided, some money so that we can have catering and make this event happen. So as I said, this is at the very end of our semester and at the very end of our program for the BFA in Community Art Education at Concordia. And so some of our students are about to graduate, and this might be one of the last things that they get to do in their classes even. So it really is a momentous occasion where we get to celebrate. And in community art education, there's this tradition of whoever you're working with and whoever you're kind of making with, to have these moments to share the work and to show the work. And as educators, sometimes we need to remember to do that for ourselves. And so today, we're going to get to see a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different projects from our students all of who have done at least 3 semesters of internships at various sites across Montreal. Some have been working in places like homeless shelters, homeschool programs, to kids, youth, adults, seniors. And it leads to a lot of really wonderful perspectives on how we engage community and how we, make art with a public, right? So that's what our discussion today is gonna focus on, and it's building on a conversation we had in class, which is what makes a community and what makes a public, and then what are those core differences and what are the similarities, and then often in the art education discourse and in the literature, sometimes community is talked about always as this wholesome thing. And is that always true? And do we always think that? But then what does it mean to engage the public and to bring in people from all over, which we're hoping to do today. So our panelists will be Miriam, Cassandra, Karina, and our lovely TA Regan. Miriam, Cassandra, and Karina have all been, doing these internships and are right at the end. And Regan has had a long career as both a curator and doing public practice and things like this. So after our discussion, we're going to break for lunch, maybe around 12:15 or 12:30. And lunch will be served, so there's going to be pizza and snacks and things like that. So I encourage folks to stick around for that. And then starting in the afternoon, we're going to run 5 consecutive workshops, or concurrent workshops, I should say, in all facets of the room. For those of you on Zoom, maybe you have time to metro down and participate in some of those. So I encourage you to stick around for that and pop into some of the ones that sound interesting to you. After this event, I'll name them off and we'll just talk a little bit about that. Also at 12:30, we're going to have 2 groups who are presenting artworks just over here in this corner, where we'll be able to, kind of observe works, talk to students about works, and for Ava's work, where folks are actually going to be able to contribute a bit to making the project. So the final thing is that at about 2:30, our student Karina, who's part of this panel discussion, is going to be opening up a podcast over here in this corner. And so I encourage folks, if you want to be on a podcast and you want to have a conversation, it's not being recorded live, or it's being recorded, but it's not playing live. So there's some of the pressure off there. I encourage you to do so. Also, at around 12:30, there's going to be a wellness space that's going to open up concurrent to our lunchtime with Farah over in the same kind of corner as the podcast. So I'm so excited. I've seen bits and pieces of these projects come together, but I'm so excited to see what the day brings. But for now, I would like everyone to give a round of applause to our brave and lovely panelists who are going to have lots of great things to say about community art education. So thank you.
All right. Is this working? Can't tell. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, David. As you had just said, this panel is meant to be kind of a culmination of all the discussions we've had in class and kind of extending it out to the public, which is the intention of our workshop and also our discussion today. Is it working? Mm-hmm. Oh, do you have the lab? Yeah. Beautiful. Okay, great. So we're going to start just by doing a little introduction of everyone and their practices. So just like a quick intro on kind of who we are and our connections to community work and our education just generally. So I could start if you'd like. My name is Miriam. I've been in Concordia for 4 years. I'm currently doing an internship at the subsidized housing unit for women. So we've been doing weekly workshops, working with the residents there. It's been really wonderful. It's really close to like the avenue that I wanted to take, and my interest in community art education is just making art more accessible, especially in communities where it's, not as present or not as funded. So I think that's kind of my avenue or interest point in being in a community art education space. And yeah, I think goals would be to kind of meld that with like a professional artistic practice and finding ways to like develop community work in that as well. Yeah. Would you like to comment? Yeah.
All right, well, my name is Karina. I'll be the moderator for today's discussion panel. So for this semester, I've done my final community internship at Suspicious Fish, which is a really cool organization that does an after-school program for elementary school kids in the area for creative writing, but we also did a lot of video producing, short form videos for this little chunk of time, and that's been really fun. And I do have a really keen interest in the community, only because, again, just to echo what Miriam said a little bit, I do feel like it's important to uplift like the underrepresented communities, especially in the arts, because of course there could be a bunch of programs for like, regular academic help, but what about arts? What about the fun things? And that's something that I really want to focus on as I transition out of Concordia and into something new. So yeah.
Hi, my name is Reagan Shrum. I am currently a first-year master's student in art education. Previous to that, I had a 15-year career in museum curation and museum education, specializing in non-traditional public programming, so worked directly with the community for a long time in different communities. And then I also have a practice, social practice is my main artistic practice, which is working with community members in a non-hierarchical way where everyone is equally paid and equally has power. And I've done that for about 10 years and have luckily been able to travel around North America doing that as well.
Hello, my name is Cassandra. I've been in Concordia for way too long. But this is my last class in art education. I've been in community for a little bit. I worked for LeRue for a while, 7 years or something like that. And this year, I'm also doing an internship at Suspicious Fish, which has been lovely. I didn't realize how much I was missing that community part. And yeah, I honestly love it. And my own practice also is very community-based. I'm trying to also organize events for my own community. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
I guess I can introduce myself as a community artist. I've worked for several years at different organizations around Montreal and in Nova Scotia. And a common theme in the places I've worked is, maintaining that studio instruction, but also offering it to as many people or as wide of an audience as we could. So most recently, I did my my kind of doctoral project at the Point St. Charles Art School, and I've been interested in how community making really brings people together from, you know, all walks of life. Because, you know, in a university classroom, it's a very, no offense to all of you and my lovely students, but it's a very specific kind of population. And in, you know, when you're in a high school or things like this, it's a very controlled environment. And what I've always loved about working in community is that you know, no one's there for a grade, no one's there for any other reason than to make art most of the time. And so I've always treasured that as part of my making process. And then through, you know, some of the more recent work I've done, you know, thinking about how art making itself can be a kind of testimony and a way for people to share their perspectives about, in my case, place and space. And you know, taking that seriously, you know, what happens when you spend long amounts of time with people kind of creating these kinds of works. So I'll cede my time there.
Thank you so much for all the lovely introductions. We're going to start with our questions. Our first question will be, what differentiates, in your opinion, the public and communities? So we could start with, let it kind of simmer for a bit, yeah. But whoever would like to begin on that note, you're more than welcome to.
I feel like public is open to everyone, right? And you can see so many faces, honestly, so many faces out there, so much art that can also be put on walls. Does that really represent you? Maybe not. I feel like that's when community comes in, because it's called community because it's calling something in you, right? Like it's part, something in there is part of you as well. So yeah, I feel like that's the main difference. I feel like community is mostly for somewhere you're gonna feel safe, almost, hopefully. And public, well, also hopefully you're safe, but it's open to everything, whatever can happen, whatever can be put out there, which is also very nice, but yeah.
Yeah, completely. It's a very good description.
I think of community as there's a disability justice advocate named Mia Mingus who has this concept called the circles of community. So it looks at it's in order to think about like healing and harm, but you kind of put yourself in the center, and then you put all the circles that are kind of closest to you, your friends, your family, and then other circles of like acquaintances, people who could find support, and then even bigger. So I identify as queer, and therefore I can kind of go to any city and find other folks who are queer and find some kind of connection to them. Public, I'm really interested in the concept of the public because though it's for everyone, I keep on thinking of this study that they did in the UK where museums are free, and so therefore it's open to the public, but who actually shows up, even though they're free, are actually still like educated, able-bodied white individuals. And that happens too in Washington, D.C., where also museums are free. So even though we have this concept of public is for everyone, depending on what the event is, depending what the space is, we still often have these ideas of, I'm not actually welcome there because maybe there's no one who represents me, or they're not thinking about the communities where I'm from.
Did you? Yeah, I think that was incredibly well said. The kind of distinction between this kind of almost inherent or assumed connection versus this unknown and also unpredictable environment where you're not sure if your specific kind of needs or predispositions are accepted or supported. I think that that's a big distinction. It kind of leads into our next question, which is the word community gets thrown around a lot. It's such a broad word, and I feel like we've been saying this all semester, but just using the word community is enough to really describe what it is. So how would you personally describe a community of people, or just this could be by describing one or multiple communities that you feel like you belong to? And the interesting thing about community is that there's communities that you are consciously a part of, and then communities that you are almost, you know, a part of, but not by choice. It's almost like you're born into certain kind of community aspects, like things that you cannot change about yourself. Like, for example, things like ethnicity and race, you're predisposed to be in a certain community through that. And then there's choices like being part of a club or a certain kind of interest level, which you could choose your level of activeness in these communities as well, and how you want to partake in them. So this is a long, meandering question, obviously, but we could kind of answer in parts. But yeah, first, just our own definitions of community, and maybe by defining communities that we feel we're a part of, if we'd like to begin with that. Yeah.
Join the Apple community. Community is often thrown around and as a word, and we do that too. I've done that too in conversation and in class, I'm sure. And what I've been more and more interested in is community as a concept really tries to cover a lot of ground.
Yeah.
In the sense that it tries to create something cohesive, right, and whole. And, I spent the last 4 or 5 years working at a community organization that, I won't give too many details, but those who know me know where I'm talking about, but it really tried to speak for the neighborhood, speak for the community, even though the active membership was relatively small and the relationship with the neighborhood was rather antagonistic. And I think what often happens is that people will come about and try to speak for a whole, even though folks who might fall under that community, some chosen, some, kind of ascribe to us, think differently. And so I'm always interested in that tension. And as much, every time I think about and try to theorize community, that tension is the thing that comes, top of mind. I think based on some conversations we've been having, within academia and things like that, we're able to do that with things like nationalism, which really tries to essentialize what is the essential American or the essential Canadian, and we can always poke at that because it never really holds water. And so with community, I think, of course there is, I'm not trying to say it's a useless term because it certainly is useful, but, where are the edges and where is the middle? I always find that just a fascinating thing to try to unpack, especially in our context where we are working with certainly communities and in community, but are sometimes we not also like working in public? And I guess I'd have to get into a definition of that. Maybe that's in the following questions, but
Yeah, we're definitely gonna get into more of the nuances between like the lines that blur and all that and further on, but yes.
So I feel like talking about the whole nationality, that pride that can bring you part of a community, yes and no. I feel like community can really be something that it's give and give. Like you are part of it because you're bringing something new or just something that feels like, you're completing something in that space. It's not just, okay, today I'm part of this community because I decided to. No, like you actually kind of need to fit in something to be able to consider yourself part of the community. So in my case, let's say like, okay, I'm immigrant. So already that it's putting me as part of a community. Then, I'm Latina, there's another one. I'm queer, there's another one. So, but am I really part of my queer community if I'm not bringing anything to the table, if I'm not fighting for the rights, if I'm not, I feel like that's where I'm going to with this. Like, yes, community can be considered so many things, but at the same time, you also need to bring your own part of it.
Yeah, I completely agree with the active participation in a community and to claim a community, but then not do like any active kind of work to like uplift it or just any of the work that's needed to be able to be in a space where people can feel comfortable and have certain aspects be like uplifted. It's like you need to to be a part of a community, you need to be an active participant as well. Or obviously there's nuance where that lies, because the line is so kind of thin and ambiguous on like what really defines a community. And yeah, one of our follow-ups is, can communities overlap, and is there tension in that?
Yeah, I mean, to go off both of what you said, the first thing I thought about was, there's an idea that a community is a monolith, when every time I work in community, that has never been the case. There's always fighting that happens, and that is part of the process of just being human, that we need to negotiate, and that's part of our job as artists, is to help that, help facilitate that if we can. But I think quite a bit of what you just said about the reciprocalness, and from an artist I worked with named France Dupanier, she taught me about the 4 R's, which are respect, reciprocal, responsibility, and relevancy. And she taught me about how when you are working with community, you need to always bring that 4 R's with you, or else you're not actually part of that community, not actually working with, collaborating with that community. And I think that's a really important part of, yes, you could claim I am part of this community, but unless you're actually working with them. And I think the overlapping is where it gets really interesting, because the intersectionality of it, there's just so many times where, within certain communities, like disabled communities, there are folks who may have such a range of experiences, and then you find you're like even more intersectional community who knows kind of what you're talking about, and has that, again, a Mia Mingus term of access intimacy, where you don't even have to share what needs you have because folks already share it. That's kind of part of the overlapping for me.
I want to go back to the idea of being a part of community because you were born into it, which is a difficult one. And I think from my own personal experience as like a mixed race person, I've always said that I feel like I don't belong in either one because I don't look like most people in that community to begin with. Like, I'm half white, my father's Italian, but I'm also half Asian, Southeast Asian, right? So it's like, I'm part of the Italian community. I grew up in a very Italian community, but I don't look like them. So they don't think that I am also part of this, right? So I think a lot of it also has to do with, how you view yourself and how you try to fit yourself into communities like this too. And how can we bridge the gap for people who maybe fit in multiple, especially when it comes to race and ethnicity? How do we make them feel also more welcome, which is something that I try to want to do in my practice as well. Same thing for those with disabilities. Like, I also have an invisible illness, but you can't tell when you look at me, right? So it's like, how do I fit in that community when visually I don't look the part, So it's all about how we can move forward and trying to like bridge gaps and bring people together anyway. Yeah.
No, very well said. There is such a tension, I feel, in these kind of overlaps, and especially as you were saying at one point, community sounds like it's an inherently positive thing, but it could feel constricting and it could feel negative, and even people who are part of certain community settings could feel completely ostracized by other, members, or just the general kind of view of a certain community, because everyone's relationship with why they're part of something is different. It's all very individual, although there's an assumption of commonality, and I think we're going to get that into like one of the next questions. But our next one will be, is being a part of a community inherently a rejection of the public, or a kind of reaction to current social climates, or against like a certain kind of status quo? Or like the broader question was, do we reach for communities when the public has failed us? Yeah.
I mean, I think about mutual aid as part of that, of, the public, the public hasn't failed us in certain ways. It's greater institutions that have failed the public. And I think, to me, I always believe in the individual, but it's hard to believe in the mass because there's just so many. And I think that's where I can think of it more in terms of communities, that what I can do in terms of mutual aid of my community and the communities I work with, that gets then spread out, that maybe I can provide something like a meal train that lets someone, have some support so that the folks that they are working with, like it extends. So it's, I guess the more you work with community, the more it extends out to the public. And so therefore it's kind of intergrained, but like to think of the mass public and to try to work with it, it's just too big of a concept. So I think you have to break it down in community, thinking that it leads to a larger public.
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
But I think that something beautiful about being part of a community, it's that because you understand how to work with community, how to work with others, it's easier to come and find other communities that can also help you work on a common problem. If like the public is not safe, let's say, the public is not functioning, then we can see what communities are around all that public space and try to find a solution out of that, because we already know how to work as a group. So, yeah.
This question makes me think a bit about some of my own challenges working in community art education. Less so, I mean, in Quebec, there is a bit more focus on the arts in public schooling. But in a lot of places, like I was at a conference in Europe, Eastern Europe, not too long ago, and I was talking about community art ed, I was presenting some of my work, and they said, what is this? Like, we do that in school, and we have this robust program, and we don't really have, and I don't know how true that was, this was one person's opinion, but I notice more and more in the United States, especially in other parts of Canada, there's this focus on community art education because the public system is lacking, and individuals don't get the kind of robust art education that we might hope in public school. I certainly didn't, even though I had wonderful art teachers, if you're listening. But I sometimes wonder, especially at a lot of the sites that you folks are working at, these are often, times where we're being called to fill in gaps. The pay for a public school teacher, while low, is more than a community art educator. And I've encountered times when public schools have actually asked me or other people to come in to fill that gap, right? And so maybe I can pose that to others. Do you ever feel that maybe, like, of course, I think we're all doing good work, but also at what point are we just kind of trying to like lift up a public system that isn't providing the kind of art education that we might hope for?
I mean, yeah, I think with that too, I believe we are uplifting a system that is failing and has always been failing, particularly for some community members. It's failing more so. But then, I personally didn't get into the arts for money. Yeah. I gave in because I felt growing up that I had a voice through art making that I didn't have otherwise. And when I started working within museums, saw how much it affected other people. I think the one concern I always have is the burnout from that, of always feeling like you have this burden on your shoulder of doing, helping community, of trying to alleviate some of what is happening in the world and our lacking systems. And I think that's where I have seen personally a lot of artists and folks working within art centers have total burnout, because not only on that, all this pressure, it's also a lack of money, as you stated, of you can find many other jobs that are being paid much better. And then that kind of go-to of institutions is, for me, I've seen you're not a team player if you're not doing at least 80 hours of work. So it's that passion is like a double-edged sword of wanting to help, but then you can burn out from it.
No, completely well said. I feel like, put it down. Yeah, the double-edged sword of wanting to contribute and wanting to kind of put your all in something, but knowing that, like you're saying, it's like you are filling a gap that no matter how much you put into it, the foundation isn't there and you're not supported. And it becomes a question of like the individual versus just like institutions in general. And it's just like you cannot take on the role and like yourself, fulfill this kind of gap that is already present. And it is really, I think, demoralizing, or I think I've kind of found that to some extent, because people come in so passionate and so wanting to do that, but then when you kind of realize that it doesn't leave just because you're there, that's when it becomes a bit like, yeah, double-edged sword, because you want to be there, but it becomes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, of course.
I think that's actually why I've been in Concordia so long, because I started with like the whole passion of I want to be an art teacher, and then working in community actually that allowed me to go in schools. The organization that I was working with really went in so many schools, so that made me like look how the system was, how teachers were treated, and that kind of really killed it for me. And then I needed to take some time off, see around, do I really want to stick to this or not? Is it worth it? And then it became more something about like, maybe it's not worth it, but I still feel like I need to do this. But for sure, there has to be some sort of balance between community and something else. Because it's sad, but we are not at the point of just being able to just live out of community work, and I think everybody knows that, but yeah, it's just, it's sad, but it's true.
It is.
I want to add just one thing.
Please.
And I think, unfortunately, it's not just us as art educators. I think it's a lot of industries of art who are feeling the same way right now. And I think what it boils down to is just like every person's just passion for it, right? It's your passion that keeps you going. We all chose this path for a reason. I want to try to end this on a more uplifting note. We all did this for a reason. We all did it because we love it to some degree. Despite of what barriers are there, I hope that, the prognosis for the future is things will get better and we will be part of a change, hopefully. That is not just in like the educator community, but like the wider artistic community in Quebec especially, yeah.
This is kind of circling back to, we had spoken about this, but though intuitively being a part of different communities implies a sense of belonging, this isn't always the case, given that everyone's relationship is so personal. The kind of question I wanted to ask about that is how could we fight isolation within community settings?
I just, when I was working more regularly as a community art teacher, I found often students were coming. Most students wanted to come to learn to paint, or whatever. But we live in a time when a lot of stuff is accessible online. You can go online and find pretty much every. And I have some critiques about learning materiality through a YouTube video. I think that there's some limitations there, but in general, most of the students I have who come actually are looking for something social as well. Yeah. And I think when I'm a teacher, I'm also kind of looking for that too. I think we could get into the inversion of what it means to be a teacher and stuff like that. But in a lot of the places I worked, there was actually moments where like I noticed everyone was like becoming friends and we're becoming friends and starting to like hang out together outside of class and all of these things. And I think that's often why people do these things is, to feel connected to something, whether they would conceive of it or think about it as a community or not.
Yeah, I have this kind of theory that everyone wants to be witnessed, and that we don't really get that many chances in our life to be witnessed for who we are, and that art making is a way through either the process of making art or the art itself. It's a way that we can be witnessed who we are, and I think part of our jobs as artists is to really support that being witnessed. And I think part of it, though, is also showing vulnerability with participants and with community members. I worked for a museum in northern BC where I did a project with a group of folks, artists with disabilities, where we worked together to do an accessibility audit of the museum itself. And these were folks who, were artists in this relatively small community, and yet most of them had never been to this art museum before, and had this connotation of no one will support me, no one will allow me to be myself and allow me to have the access, talk about access needs I need in order to even show up there. And part of my job was to make sure that all their access needs were met and that the staff treated them in a supporting manner so that years down the line they could go to that museum and feel like they could be themselves and could show up to events. And I think part of that was me being vulnerable and talking to them about my experience of museums, of how even working within museums, I have felt a real pushback of they want a certain type of audience that is often able-bodied to show up. And I think just being honest and truthful about yourself, and that kind of helps vulnerability. And I think that's when folks can then have that social aspect.
Just have a quick thing to add, just hearing what you're saying. Most of the people in this class have taken studio art courses before in university. And that, I don't know what your experiences were like, but for me, it was always like, okay, teacher over there. Good ones were circulating and some were reading a book, but lots of open making time. But one of the things that I have really enjoyed is the inventiveness when you're in community to find different ways of being an artist and engaging in like questions and things like that. And vulnerability, it's hard, I think, as an artist, especially when you go to certain kinds of galleries and more commercial galleries. There's a lot of maybe secrecy around process and things like that. And one of the things I've always really loved is, when I was teaching painting regularly, I would bring my own stuff and I would paint. And that's a thing in university that I've never seen happen. Maybe other folks have had different experiences, but just sharing, I think, as a teacher, first of all, to design a lesson as a creative act, to design a lesson that's relating to a certain community is doubly challenging, but also, sharing what you're also doing to folks who maybe are encountering art for the first time. I always found that really enriching, but also like challenging to that part of me that, has done my MFA and things like that, because it's a very different kind of environment. And I think that's one of the exciting parts about what we do is, meeting, in different environments, but also, it does require a bit more. I think vulnerability is the right word. Yeah.
It almost feels like detachment of ego as well, for what you're saying. Because it's very easy if you have like a whole career in arts to, like you said, not care enough and just have your students do their thing. But as soon as you put that aside and remember that you actually also were a student at some point, that you can help these students accomplish something and maybe build a community out of that, you're leaving that pretentious part, if you ever had it, aside, and actually creating something more powerful even out of that.
Yeah, did you? Just to echo some of the things that were said, I found that especially in the set I'm in at the moment, every time we do an activity, I do it too. I think it's like, especially when you're working with vulnerable populations, you have to build a trust with the people as well. You can't expect that people will like have this interest or engagement if they don't trust you, if they don't see, like, or they don't see that you respect them too. It has to be reciprocal, it has to be apparent too. And you really have to be sure to, yeah, like remove the ego part. You're fully present as they are, as a peer, as well as a teacher and educator. And it's, I think, when those lines kind of cross is where you could be vulnerable, and then you get more engagement. Like I've seen like progressively, like people go for the social aspect. People don't want to be isolated. Like in the program that like the residents are in, they have to do one activity a week. And you could tell the people who are like, this is the activity I have to do a week. And the people who are like, I want to do the art activity. So you really have to meet people where they're at in terms of engagement as well. And that's like another ego thing. It's like you can't expect that either. And it becomes so much more fruitful that way. And we're able to build like a rapport with people and a relationship that's so much more personal in that sense, when you really like put yourself in like the same, you know, you just have to like cater that kind of respect. Yeah. And I remember I don't know, I think there needs to be so much more of a focus and kind of showing people that they can be in these spaces and they're not exclusive spaces, especially with art. Oh my God, I think there's so many people who have such like a preconceived notion of what it is to like be able to make art or be in like art spaces. We did like, I took the residents like on a field trip to a gallery, and they're just, it was one of those moments where it's like, oh, like this is actually really close by to like the co-op and all that. And it's like, you could go here and it's actually like accessible, it's free. And like, there's a little, I don't know, the way that we were talking about it and engaging with it, like you realize how much people like really care to have like someone take the time to do that with them, and how comfortable it makes them feel to be able to do that themselves as well, and to be able to also like be in the position where they can speak and like talk about their experiences too. And you could see like the way that, you know, people engage in that way. And it's really, that's my favorite part about working in community sites, is like seeing the way people respond and come into themselves and feel more confident too. And it's, yeah, I think that's the most like, I don't know, all kind of saddening things aside, into the whole burnout part, seeing that makes it so worth it, honestly. Yeah, my next question is kind of just, did anyone else have something to say first? Sorry, I completely cut that off. Where is the line between personal practice and community work? That was another question I had, especially in the context of like being in art spaces, being either a practicing artist or working like in other art spaces outside of just specific community work. Like, do you feel a kind of separation between professional and personal practice? Oh my God.
I think sometimes it's necessary to have that line. It's not an obligation, but for sure, you can be your own person, you can have your own practice, and it still be part of something. The line doesn't be to be a cutting line between both of them. It's just your own space, and then you can bring it out to the public, which makes it part of a community as well. So, yeah,
I've had the opportunity to do a lot of social practice work while hired under a museum, and that is where I find it is very difficult, because basically the museum is asking you to use your personal connections to community to then, I like to use the word infiltrate almost, to represent the museum, even though maybe the museum isn't actually doing the work within that community. Oh. So that's the hard line that I have personally found of, I do want to try to keep them separate, but when you are doing it to try to make money as a paying artist, but then it feels like this really weird thing of, depending on the museum I've worked with, sometimes they're like, we'll let you do whatever you'd like. Other times they really want to emphasize certain things so that the museum is starting to build a relationship with said community. And I know in that text that a lot of folks had to read for our education, the Pamela Harris Lawton, she suggested to find like a network connection. But whenever I read that, I think, well, it just sounds like this really like, you have to think about that network connection, because you're kind of asking folks who already have this personal connection and actually put it on the line. So you really have to trust that this project is actually going to be, it's actually even needed by the community. Maybe it isn't needed and it's being forced upon them. So in my time, I've had to really question certain projects, whether I actually would put my personal relationships with community on the line or not.
Yeah, an extension to that, are there any like specific kind of aspects of your personal practice or your identity that you feel like you cannot bring into professional settings, or, and just to extend that even further, like, is there room for that to be developed or challenged?
So yeah, I think everybody's personal practice is different. I think most of you know by the stuff that I've presented in class this semester that I work a lot with like media and digital and tech stuff. And I find sometimes, and I'm really excited about it, and I know that, and I work with kids. A lot of the time the kids are really excited on learning how to like implement and how to use like tech and media and stuff in their own work and in their own practices. Like the kids at Suspicious Fish this semester were like super into video making. They were like, I want to animate, I want to make, and they were showing me all these things that they made, and I'm like, this is awesome, and this is what I wanted. Like, because animation was my first practice, it was my first degree, but it's difficult to implement these types of tools in the public because it is costly. It costs so much money to do this, and to even upkeep it as my own practice. Like this costs money, and I know some of my friends watching at home right now can vouch for this, guys. So I find it's difficult to implement, but the want for it is there, and this is where I'm sort of like at a loss right now, because I'm like, the kids want to learn this stuff. This is so relevant to them. How can I make this more accessible for them? How can I give this to them in a way that they can use it on their own time and they don't have to ask their parents for like, hey, can I have $200 for an Adobe subscription, you know, or like something like that. So like this is where I'm at a loss right now, but like I'm really trying to work through and find like what are some free other resources that people can use every day and like start to get into this stuff, because tech is advancing so fast every year, every month. And I think it is worthwhile to like sort of get to know it just a little bit. But that's my own personal perspective.
Yeah, there's such a big part of being in a community groups or working with the community is having to be so resourceful when there's a lack of resources. And it's really hard, especially when you're trying to bring something in that's like a particular kind of niche thing, and you're trying to really develop something to like a decently far extent.
Yeah.
It is so hard to be able to, within like a space, first of all, get that funded, and just, have the resources and the space to really be able to like delve into it in the way that you would want to, especially when there's interest. That's what makes it so hard. When there's so much interest from like the people participating in these kinds of settings, and then you feel like you can't provide to the extent that you would like dream to. It's such a hard kind of line to be in. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think there's a couple threads, going on here, but the resourcefulness, I think, is I, as much as possible, try not to teach anything that can't be purchased from the dollar store. And, I've had lists that could be entirely purchased for under $10, but that's not always possible with things like tech. And, we live in a time as well where libraries, which can be at the forefront of these things, or other kind of public resources, are also struggling to kind of keep everything going. So, that resourcefulness, but also showing like, because all art making can be expensive. If you go to Desserres, you look at the wall of paint and there's with inflation, $10 tubes and the $30 tubes and the $90 tubes, but you can make really great art for, 3 of those $10 tubes and you can take you a long way, right? But, that's kind of an extension of a lot of this, these questions around community, is that resourcefulness, and then, how those things connect. But I've taken that, and, because we were talking about our own practices, I've taken that to heart in my own practice. And, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of really like cheap, cost-wise anyway, hopefully not cheap looking, like materials that, turn into these works that I'm quite happy with, because, I know the difference between the $90 paint and the $10 paint, but, it's not that big of a difference that it can't be, shared a bit more extensively.
All right, well, I think we're at our final question, given our time. If you want to open it to anyone else who'd like to have a little Q&A. Sometimes it feels like, in terms of accessibility, how can we make community spaces more accessible? I think that we've already kind of like tiptoed in that with how we approach materials and how we approach our own, like what we bring into these spaces, especially prioritizing. Well, I know that that's what I've been trying to do in my own personal like teaching practice, especially in the setting I'm in, is trying to bring in materials and things that would be realistically accessible for the people attending these sessions. It's not about like bringing like, I don't know, this whole like savior, like I'll bring all these grandiose things to you, but then you can't take anything from it, because like it becomes like a one-time thing rather than something I could like continue to practice. Like, what are ways that we can kind of be in these roles and do things like that could kind of get people to engage and continue to engage when we're not there or we're not present?
I know I said I wouldn't talk very much because you've all heard so much from me this semester, but I think, there's a distinction to be made between accessibility and inclusion.
Yeah.
And, anyone can go to the library or the gallery for the most part anytime they want, and it's free. And you were mentioning DC, right? And the population of DC is not who you see is not who you see represented visiting museums, right? And I don't have a good answer to that, but, and I'm all for making things free. I think that's the starting point to inclusion, is not having that financial barrier, but then, outreach becomes really important. And sometimes I've always found it to be a bit finicky. Like when I was at the art school, sometimes we would send an email and we would get 35 registrations. And sometimes we would send 20 emails to get 4 registrations for something else. And it was I could never figure out what was it about one thing that resonates and brings people in and something else that doesn't.
That just reminded me, at some point I had a lesson plan that was designed to, make art, but also I was bringing it up as something that then my students could use for like selling stuff, selling t-shirts. And I was being called out on that because art shouldn't be made for like money. But there's something about that it still kind of bothers me, because yes, I get that part, but depending on which community you are working with, sometimes you need those skills. You need to know how to make an easy t-shirt, a bag, whatever, how to start from zero without nothing and build up from that to actually have something beautiful that you could sell if you wanted to, and that could help for whatever projects you're working with, right? So yeah, I feel like it's important that we, as art educators, that we bring art as something that they could start from nothing. Whoever doing this could have started from nothing and not like going for the expensive paint, you know, because it can look so inaccessible sometimes.
Yeah.
And it really isn't. Like, if you know how to do things out of nothing, then it really isn't.
Yeah, when I think about accessibility, I think about, there's physical accessibility of the space itself. There's financial accessibility, whether folks can afford. There's cultural accessibility, whether folks feel safe in the space, whether they can bring up an idea and the teacher won't judge them or will actually, in fact, encourage them. Or even remember if the artist is maybe from the same kind of background, maybe same race or ethnicity or class or ability. And then there's also like kind of communication and type of educational, like is the thing you're going to teach them more based in visual, but do you not have many visual learners there? So making sure that you adapt it. And I think, thinking about all these different ways of accessibility can really help instead of whenever I and having a conversation about it. I think too often accessibility is like the checkbox kind of situation. And really, I think giving agency to anyone who is participating and asking them about what they need, and keep on, like, those needs may change. So keeping on having those discussions will really kind of help and make sure folks are actually enjoying what that they're there for.
I feel like that what makes also the difference between art educators in community and schools,
Yeah.
right? Schools, everybody's doing the same thing, and they all have to succeed at the same task, the same way. Obviously, it's not realistic, but that's what we're being asked for. And then community, we can actually listen to the people that we're working with and build something for them.
Yeah, just going to add to actually a point you made earlier around, selling things and this aversion. It's kind of like as artists, we're kind of okay if people are selling things for like $10,000 or something. But I've noticed in a lot of my students, they really felt like, especially, students just, for example, learning to paint, they really felt validated when we had exhibitions and someone came by and said, how much for this, like, painting, right? And okay, it's not going to like pay all the person's bills, and the chances of anyone selling work to sustain a life is negligible. But we also live in a society where, that's how we value things, is with money. And so, yeah, I always question that, because I think people are able to, make part of their living or some living from learning crafts and knitting and things like that. That's all part of the process. So, if someone wants to buy a painting or a drawing or t-shirts or something like that, I think that comes back to some of that community level sustainability where, it's not possible all the time to decommodify or anything like that. Sometimes it's the most prudent thing is to actually, make things to sell. And why not?
I guess I can see how that could get tricky though.
Yeah.
I feel like if you are making things out of the love that you have for that, whatever you're doing, and then it happens that you could also sell it, then good. But if you're just making things to sell it, it can actually kill your passion for art, because if you're not selling it, then you feel like your worth is not there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. I feel like, do you have something to say? Okay. Yeah. I think the only way to really be able to do that is, as you were saying, engage and respond with the people who you're actually meeting with and working with. I think there's no community without actually like reciprocity. Yeah, so I I think we're gonna wrap up now. It was such a wonderful conversation, and thank you everyone for all your fruitful points. It's really lovely, and now we have like a good 5 minutes
Ish
ish.
to do.
Until the pizza gets here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Q&A.
exactly.
So if any of you in the audience have any questions, and I know that we're also doing it on Zoom, so if there's Zoom comment questions, we can look at that too. Raise your hand. You can direct it at either everybody on the panel or just one specific person. Up to you, but we'll open the floor to that now, if you have any.
Or just
Anyone on-
any
Comments?
Sorry. Yeah, or just any comments on any of the points we discussed, or any personal kind of input that you'd like to add to anything too. It doesn't have to be a pointed question. It could just be a comment as well.
Those of you joining us on Zoom, if you wanted to pop your question into the chat, we could read it out. Anyone in the space? Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to say, like, I really liked when you guys talked about this, like, the identity of being an artist and also an art educator. I feel like if you can talk a little bit more about it, like when you practice being an art educator or like work in the community, but at the same time, like keep your own practice going, like also progressing with it, that would be really good. Thank you.
Yeah, I find that very difficult to do because for me, like part of my art practice is I'm always an educator. Like wherever I go, I am either learning from, so I become the student from folks I work with, or I am teaching something. And I think that's just me as an individual. I always love learning and teaching. But there is this, it's difficult. I have always found it very difficult to do my practice on the side when I'm working full time. And then especially, you would think a person working within art museums all day would want to make art because I would get to see it, but I actually get kind of tired of art when I was working full time in art museums, because I got to the lovely chance of working with artists directly, and I was so inspired by their projects, but I would come home exhausted from that burnout that we talked about. And I think about like finding the time and kind of making time in my schedule just to make stupid art, like art that means nothing to me, but like can give me joy because I get to do something for 10 minutes. I do a lot of like, for fun, I have kind of my professional art practice, but then I do a lot of like cross-stitch kits that I change up and add to. And that's kind of my, I'm gonna watch TV and I'm gonna do some cross-stitching. So I think having different parts of my artistic practice to kind of really divvy up of like, even when I'm exhausted, I can always do cross-stitching because I find it meditative.
Yeah, that happened to me too. I was working full-time muralist for an arts organization. I had to leave that part too because it was taking too much of my time. And also like painting, right now I still have a little bit of a problem with that because I did so much painting for work that now I just didn't feel like doing it for myself anymore. So I feel like you need to put your priorities at some point and find a balance, even if it's not easy. Balance between money, balance between what makes you happy when you work. If you want to add your work to the community, then also add it there. And then if art is also as important for you, you also need to put it there, right? And then find some sort of way for it to work. That's where I'm right now. Do I still have to work on it? Yes. But if you don't do it, some of those things are never gonna be making you like happy, because one of them is taking too much of your time. One of them is not paying you enough. One of them, like there's always a problem. So yeah.
Yeah, to echo what both of you said, working it into your working week, for me, it was like when I was the busiest in the last few years, when I was writing my thesis, I would paint these little tiny box paintings that usually when I was in my undergrad and grad school, there was like an arms race to like build who can make the biggest painting. And I thought, why don't I make the smallest painting I can possibly make? And I made, probably 100 of those just over the time, right? And when I was teaching painting, I was painting in, an hour for instruction and circulation, but then I can only bother the students so much. So I would spend 2 of those hours painting. And I made a lot of paintings in that time. And, I just make another in, that little bit, like I think we often think about an artist as someone who's in the studio 9 hours, 10 hours a day till 2 in the morning sometimes, and gets up and paints. And I don't know anyone that works like that. But I know the most productive artists I know just find, 2 hours, 3 hours a day, and you're going to make an awful lot of stuff, for better or worse, but,
Yeah, just having a bit of time, I think, to devote to these things really makes it easier. And like making a little bit art, or like shitty art, as you were saying, is better than not doing anything at all. So I feel like to keep you kind of engaged and like keep the fire kind of fueled, just doing, it could be small, it could be menial, but it's better than not doing anything at all if you want to keep this balance or like sustain that kind of passion. I think it's a good way, but I think we're at time.
Yeah,
So
if there's like one last question that somebody
Yeah.
wants to pop in, that's okay. If not, then we will wrap up. Thanks for, yeah. Okay, that's cool. Thanks, guys.
all right, well, thank you so much, everybody.
I think we should clap. Okay, thank you all. Thank you for coming in for this panel. Thank you for communicating with community. Thank you for your questions. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but this remains available on our YouTube channel, and you can revisit it. You can share it. And stick around. We got some more things happening this afternoon. Okay. Pizza. Yeah, if you're here, it's pizza.